Right, so the first movement we know is from dawn till noon. It's really a programmatic piece. The thing about Debussy that really differentiates him from other composers, like you've got Rachmaninoff, who also wrote a piece that kind of details the sea. But if you listen to the two pieces, if you listen to the Debussy piece and compare it to the Rachmaninoff piece, you're going to notice that Debussy's is very much actually depicting the what could be sort of the ocean starting to become more active in the morning, whereas Rachmaninoff uses a lot of more traditional motivic development and formal sections to make his piece make sense. So Debussy is this piece is pretty unique in that it truly is a programmatic work that really focuses on just kind of moving from one idea to the next. The first movement is actually not like the other two movements. We'd call it an open piece, an open form piece. It's really kind of composed based on the concept of the ocean kind of awakening, and eventually at noon it settles down a little bit on that final D flat major chord. But I'm going to show you a few things that are happening in here. Some of these we talked about a little bit last week, but he basically puts this piece together with a few key themes. Your first one that you're going to notice, I think you guys can see my cursor, but there's this B pedal that he starts the piece out with. And I talked about this last time, but that's very reminiscent of gamelan music, which was a huge influence for Debussy. So that was something that he was really attuned to. And he uses this gamelan concept throughout the piece. He actually uses the gamelan tuning where you have these open fifths at one point, which I'm going to show you when we get to it. The opening idea here, notice this F sharp and the G sharp, just that major second. This actually sets the stage for a lot of thematic development within the composition. You'll see it right here, where you've got the 16th to the dotted 8th motive. This motive is sort of a preview of this syncopated 16th note motive that Dr. Vega actually outlined in a box for you. And then you have this opening idea that's really based on a pentatonic scale. So you've got already from the very beginning, you've got three different ideas. You've got this pedal point, you have this pentatonic scale tetrachord that's kind of like the ocean rising, and then you have this syncopated 16th note motive that's also formed from these kind of syncopated ideas, right? So it's kind of like the ocean waves that are overlapping. So you can really hear how the ocean is sort of starting to come alive here in the opening section. So when we go on to the next part, you'll notice that F sharp and G sharp are still there, but they came from right here, right? In the very second bar, he introduced that idea and he just inverted this idea, and he's starting to create this theme that he brings back over and over again in different ways throughout the composition. So even though Debussy is sitting here and he's talking about how he doesn't really believe in an intellectual process towards music, there's some very analyzable stuff here in just the first two pages. You can see where his motives are coming from. And in a sense, it's a very organic composition that's sort of building out of these basic blocks that he's created. So at this point, we've got that 16th note motive and it's starting to develop into a more melodic idea. We also have some half diminished harmonies if you actually analyze everything that's going on with the horns and all the woodwinds. And the main idea here is that he's using this very strong sense of voice leading to tie everything together. So here we've got this dissonant kind of minor second pull, and then it just comes back down, and we're kind of creating this effect of a wave. These quarter note ideas right here, these come back later when he actually turns them into open fifths, which again are sort of a throwback to the gamelan style music that he was apparently very influenced by. So if we go forward here, we get a new theme. This some people call it the call of the sea motive. When it comes to identifying motives, you can really use any terms you want, but often we call this one the call of the sea motive because it's the real first melodic idea we have in the piece. And this is just an Aeolian C scale. It plays it in both the English horn and the trumpet. And you'll notice what he's doing, he always has multiple ideas going on at the same time. So these quarter notes are continuing, and they stemmed from right here. So how does he make these quarter notes sound really important? He starts in the high tessitura here in the violins, right? They really stand out. Compare that to, 3 octaves difference between this initial motive. He's putting everything in its own octave register so that everything really stands out. And once you hear this quarter note motive, and the tremolo, yeah, absolutely. And so then once you hear these quarter note motives, you kind of can't unhear them. So even though we've got this stepwise motion here, repeats of the octave and then an octave lower, once we get to this part here, it just becomes kind of an undercurrent, right? It's just there to kind of support everything above it. And he can bring the textures a little bit closer together, even. And it's still noticeable as two very defining ideas. And so what Debussy's doing is he's setting it up so that at some point he can mix 2, 3, and 4 different ideas together at the same time, and you hear each individual idea. So if you think back to your counterpoint courses that most of you have probably taken at some point, the whole point of counterpoint is to create these multiple independent lines that stand out. So how do you do that? Often in first species, you just have one note against one note. Then you go to second species where you have half notes against a whole note. Just the rhythmic change between those two lines allows those two independent melodies to stand out. So what Debussy's doing is he's introducing these ideas in a very dramatic way, in a way that really stands out, so that then he can make it a little bit more subtle, but you still remember these basic ideas that build the entire piece. So here we get this 16th motive returned, but it's using a little bit of diminution here because he's constricted the values. They're not as prolonged anymore because you already recognize these ideas, right? They've already been introduced very slowly, and so hopefully at this point you're starting to become more familiar with the melodic content. And here we have that quarter note motive again. So he's layering all these different ideas on top of each other. So here we have that opening idea again, right? Comes back, and what does he do here? He speeds it up. So we're getting some diminution of that opening idea. And now we're getting these quarter note figures are just kind of viscerating back and forth. They're kind of rocking back and forth. And he's adding that idea of the opening syncopation that we had right here, with kind of created that wave sound. He's going back and forth now between these two ideas. This is how he creates the undercurrents. This is how he creates a sense that there is this ocean floor that's kind of undulating underneath the waves that are kind of going up and coming back down. So again, it's like the wave of Hokusai, where it actually looks like the wave of Hokusai. If you look at this, it really resembles the imagery of a rising wave here. That everything here would be like the fishermen's boats that are just kind of waiting on the water. This really starts to look more and more like a wave. So at this point, he's got 3 ideas still going. He's got this pentatonic tetrachord that goes up. He has that opening major second motive. And now he has this syncopated thing happening. And here's a 4th idea. He's got these quarter notes on the tremolos a little bit lower now, because they don't have to be so high. He can take them down the register because now they're very familiar to you. So what we're seeing so far is he's using a lot of pentatonic materials. In the very opening of the piece, these pentatonic ideas are primarily what he uses to set up the piece. Pentatonic and a few modes, right? So if you look at the accompaniment in the second violin and viola, so right down here, this is really just a pentatonic accompaniment. So he's kind of using these opening materials now to create some more texture. And then here we get this ostinato figure in the cello that just repeats. But what does this ostinato do? Does anybody remember where it comes back? It comes back later in the piece as a solo, right? So he's introducing yet a new theme. And that's why a lot of people say that this is a very open form in the beginning, because it's just kind of building off previous ideas and adding to it. So if we keep going, you notice this theme here in the cello, it's very similar to what we have here in the woodwinds. So this is a new theme. This is what some people call the woodwind theme. I think some people also call it the wind theme because it's played by the wind instruments. But typically, right here, you've got this pentatonic theme, so it sounds related to the opening materials, but then you've got this D flat acoustic scale it's occurring here. So the D flat acoustic scale, if you guys aren't familiar, probably the easiest way to think about it is a Lydian scale with a flat 7. It's also known as the overtone scale. It's based loosely on the 8th through the 14th harmonic of the overtone series. And it's just, ideally, it kind of fits more with the natural overtones we have in music. So he introduces yet a new theme for the first time on this acoustic scale. Does this look related to anything that we've seen before? Can anybody relate it to anything that came previously? I mean, I guess there's a little bit of syncopation there, and that idea isn't new. But as far as the melodic content, it's pretty striking because it's really the first time we hear this theme. So, how does he bring it out? He really kind of isolates it in octaves here to make sure that you can really hear this new theme. So, if we continue on pretty quickly after, we get a return of this woodwind theme, right? And again, it's still in pentatonic. What he does eventually is he'll take this pentatonic scale and he'll turn it into, I believe it's Mixolydian, and at some point he actually turns it into a whole tone as well. So he's really trying to make you very familiar with the melodic materials before he goes through and starts changing everything up on you. So then here we've got some bassoons. They present the theme in B flat. So there's a B flat pentatonic scale right here. And then this is just kind of a return of that original theme. So he's using this theme quite often throughout the piece to kind of create coherence. So it's not just that he's kind of composing purely by inspiration. He is thinking about these themes and he's bringing them back to create coherence and push the piece along. Okay, so that's kind of a repeat of that. All right, so here, this is where it starts getting a little bit interesting. You see this flute part. The first two measures here, you have an A flat Aeolian scale. And then what does he do the second time? He turns it into an octatonic scale. These are both recognizable as kind of being the same thing because they're basically using the same rhythm. So that creates a lot of coherence here. But then he modifies it by just turning this into an octatonic scale. And look at what else is happening in the bass. You've got all these syncopations, and really not a whole lot is going on. It's just sort of a textural idea behind this melody. So this really is the feature of this particular section. And he starts to do this a lot. As we're getting closer towards the middle of the piece, he's starting to take these ideas that were originally in a pentatonic scale, and he's going to start to use other scales and the same rhythms to modify them and kind of create a more organic approach to creating this composition. So we get the acoustic scale theme returning again here in the French horn. Right here. Oh, couldn't see it for a minute. Okay, so here's that theme returning again. And this time it's buried in a thicker texture. But he can do that. It's still going to stand out. One, because the French horns are very powerful. They'll cut through. And two, you've already heard that theme before. So when you hear it, it'll kind of crop up and you'll recognize it. We've also got this idea of the octaves, where we're playing everything at different octave registers. So here, this is where it starts to get a little bit tonal. We have kind of an A flat minor chord here in measure 6. If you look at the underlying harmony, not measure 6, but rehearsal 6, measure 1, if we're counting from rehearsal 6. And then in measure 2, we kind of get the D flat harmony. And then in measure 3, it goes back to A flat. Then it kind of continues here. We get sort of an E9 chord here at the end. And then it comes back to A flat here, or D flat here. So what he's doing is he's creating this perfect fourth relationship. And then he's also including that E. And we really have a very tonal sounding harmony here. And he's doing this right before we come to kind of the climax of the piece. So he's using the concept of tonality to give you some bearing on where you are in the composition, to kind of help you get your landmarks. Now, look at this. So the first time we saw this theme, I believe it was over here, it was an Aeolian scale, and then it turned into an octatonic scale. It's coming back again here, but this time he's using F Locrian. So he can do this because that rhythm is very recognizable. You're going to be able to recognize that as relating to the initial rhythm simply because we're using the same rhythm. So you could really change the notes and create some variety here. This is where we start to combine ideas in a much more active way. So here we have a combination of the pentatonic scale from the woodwinds up here, and then we also have the call of the C entered here in the trumpets. And if you look at the score, you'll see that it actually continues. So here's our call of the C happening again. So he's starting to combine all these different themes. Now, then really it's on the next maybe 2 pages later in the score. You've got the Gamelan Orchestra. So these open fifths are pretty common. They sound very reminiscent of that Gamelan orchestra. And it kind of brings back that idea of that opening B pedal because they're related. So anybody that listened to gamelan music would probably hear these open fifths, these parallel fifths, and that B pedal as being somewhat related. So he's making a connection with this as well. All right, so here, if you know anything about gamelan music, and I only know a little bit, but often these sustained pedal points are used to differentiate different sections. So here we've got a pizzicato, which really kind of accents that F. And then we have this sustained F that sort of creates a pedal. So that's one way he's kind of showing you that a new section's been initiated here. And then for the first time, we have 16 cellos playing. This is a cello quartet, these 4 lines here. And they play an opening idea here, this, it's reminiscent of the opening 16th note rhythm. And then it launches into a new melody. So this helps tie everything together. So when you listen to this piece, you don't really hear all these melodies as being disconnected. They really seem to flow out of each other. And the way that Debussy does this is by using very similar rhythmic motives to hold everything together.
Would
Now
this
when
be
we
an
get,
example? Oh, I'm so
go
sorry.
ahead. No, go for it.
Would this be an example of integral serialism? Because that's kind of what I was talking about, and how like he used rhythms instead of just the 12-tone row to create the serialist nature of the piece. That's, yeah.
Yeah, I read that in your comments, and I would agree that it's definitely sort of the start of it. I wouldn't say it's fully worked out integral serialism, but it definitely uses some ideas from it.
Okay.
So, absolutely, I can definitely see where you're coming from on that. And I think you're absolutely right that this concept here does sort of apply, maybe in a looser way, though. So, if we continue, these triplet figures that he introduced with that flute melody, he can now introduce them again, and they kind of harken back to that initial flute melody. So it sounds related to the flute simply because we're using these triplets. And it ends up creating this sound like ripples on the waves. This is almost a textural idea. It reminds me a little bit of Schoenberg's um, first string quartet, or one of his early string quartets. I don't think it's the first one, where he just has like these ripples on a lake, and it's just very a textural feeling. So he's creating the sound of these ripples just by using these triplet motives that he introduced earlier. And then here you kind of have an inverse of that 16th dotted eighth note rhythm, even though it's part of a triplet, we still hear it is related. So he's manipulating all these different motives that he introduced very clearly in the early stages, and now he's making them more subtle. He's making the piece much more organic. It's starting to become much more free. It's almost like this initial 16th note motive that we had, where the 16th going to the dotted eighth, is growing up in a way. It's becoming harder to see where it came from. But if you kind of reverse engineer this a little bit, you can kind of see how they're related. So then most of the themes at this point have been introduced, and now for the next several bars, he just interplays between the various sections. He throws them around to different sections within the orchestra. Often you get multiple themes that are played at once, which he can do now because we've already been introduced to all these individual themes. So we have an idea of how the story is progressing, and everything's just kind of occurring at the same time. He continues to modify themes using modes, pentatonic scales, whole tone scales, and the acoustic scale. So as we reach the end of the piece, we get this strong A flat here in the bass. Again, reminiscent of that opening B pedal, right? But it's a major second lower. So that also is kind of reminiscent of that major second ascending figure. But as the piece is dying down, we're actually coming down in pitch. So this Gamelan style pedal brings about the new section. The English horn, this is an interesting part. I actually find this to be really interesting. But if you look at the English horn, it has this descending melody that uses an A flat mixolydian scale, and then it ascends using a whole tone scale. So he's almost mirroring that idea of the melodic minor scale, but he's using A flat mixolydian descending and whole tone ascending. And when you listen to this in the score, if you listen to this piece again after going over everything that I've kind of showed you, you'll find that this continues for several measures. And he does that because he's really trying to illustrate this point that he's doing this on purpose. This is a characteristic feature at this point. And that continues all the way to the end of this section. So then we get this chorale that's reminiscent of the C motive, where we have these triplets, and then we have sort of this D flat down to A flat. Remember those D flat and A flat chords that I pointed out earlier? Debussy doesn't introduce something unless he's going to use it in a different way later on. So this A flat and D flat, now you know why I pointed that out, they're related. That's where that material came from. It came from the harmonies. So he really likes to hide his motives in the music when he can. And then they become larger portions of the piece, but most of us, we're listening to this, we don't hear the relationship between this D flat and A flat melody and essentially what happened earlier, right? But that's kind of how those are related with that perfect fourth. So here we get the pentatonic theme. It comes back one last time right here in the woodwinds. And at the end of the piece, we get this D flat harmony that ends really strongly, and then one last reference to those Gamelan open fifths. You'll see them here, right? And then here, piece of the octave. So the entire piece actually has a lot of structure to it. For being an open form, the entire piece is tied together by these motives. If you look at the second and the third movement, the forms are more standard. So this is almost like a fantasia where he just kind of goes all over the place. So you have the presentation here. Now that I've kind of gone through everything, you can follow along with a score as well as these slides and listen to the piece. And that will give you an even better understanding of actually how he's developing everything in the composition.